Hi, I'm Ben Solomon. Today I'll talk about what is big government. It's based on my decade work experience in what is today known as stress testing. So let's start. Let me share the screen. Okay, so what is big government? Summary, there are three things I want to get across in this presentation. It's a short presentation. First, the Congressional Budget Office of November 8th, 2021 estimates are timid. Second, I propose a measurable definition for big government. It's based on how we do stress testing and then we infer certain properties of the budget. And finally, who is paying taxes? Okay, first piece we look at is the federal budget, money coming in and money going out. And this is taken from the Congressional Budget Office monthly budget review for fiscal year 2021. The new budget has not been factored in here. At least I think it has not been factored in here. And these numbers are in billions of dollars. So the years are 2019, 2020, and 2021. And you can see that the major sources are individual income taxes, payroll taxes, corporate income taxes, and other receipts. And down here, I've presented these totals as a percentage of GDP. Okay, one thing to note here is what an individual pays as taxes is noted as individual income tax. There's a second component that is not usually widely spoken about, which is the payroll taxes, Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security benefits. And we see that when you combine the two, what an individual pays, and as a population, the total individual contributions adds up to about 85% of the federal budget source of funds. And corporate taxes are about 6 to 10% of source of funds for the federal budget. So the important lesson here is that the federal budget is funded primarily by individual taxpayers. So let's look at the money going out and the major categories. Mandatory spending, you have to spend it whether you like it or not. And it's the three most important components, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And this consists of about 35 to 47%, 50% of the expenditures. The rest of it is refundable tax credit, unemployment compensation, small business administration stuff, coronavirus relief fund, the military, and the interest paid on public debt. That means the treasury notes that the government has sold to receive money in to fund whatever it needs to fund due to the shortfall between sources, money coming in and money going out. So what we see is that important things to realize is that the mandatory spending is 35% of budget, approximately. And public debt between the years 1971, I'll show the data in a minute, and 2020, public debt as a percentage of GDP ranged between 23.18% and 111%. And the interest outlay, the interest that the government paid, varied between 1.1% and under 4%. However, the effective interest rate, when you use these two numbers, you find that the effective interest rate that the government paid is between 1.64% and 9.2%. We'll see a little bit more of that in a minute. So when you look at the data and you start building a model to figure out what's going on, you see that the Congressional Budget Office is presenting a budget forecast that is not a stress test version. We have all heard about the bank stress test. Yes, any financial statement or economic statement can have a stress test if you know how to do it. My opinion is that the budget forecast is very conservative. And since it's very conservative, you can do a lot of things that may or may not make sense and still get CBO approval. So there are two, for the stress testing, I used two worst cases, a good worst case where the interest rate increases by 0.38% per year, and a bad worst case where the interest rates the government pays for its treasury bonds is 0.75%. And this is all based on historical data. The 0.75% is based on this slope here, and the 0.38% is based on this slope, this slope, this slope, this slope, this slope, and this slope, and a little bit of this. So you get, these are, why I'm explaining this is because these are realistic numbers. It can happen. It's happened in the past. And this is about 2020, 2021. So this is the CBO's actual net interest outlays as a percentage of GDP. And this is the CBO's forecast of net interest outlays as a percentage of GDP. If you look at, this is the debt, the public debt, that as a proportion of GDP, and you can see that it jumped around 2008, 2009, and that's because of quantitative easing. And if you use these numbers provided, you can work backwards and figure out the actual interest rate that the government paid on its public debt. And it's a high of 9.2% around 82, 83, and it's a low of about just under 2% in 2020. So what we see, this is a steep change compared to previously. So essentially what we know is Congress changed the rules, whether rightly or wrongly. That's not the point. We are observing what the data is showing us. And we know that inflation has leaped in the recent months to about 5 to 6% from about 1 to 2% to about 5 to 6%. And that you can say is standard economic theory, which is excess money chasing too few goods. Excess money was caused by quantitative easing, from many years ago. It's still, you can see it's still there, it's still present, and chasing too few goods as a result of the supply chain issues. One of the things we have to note is that payroll taxes is basically for monetary spend, for mandatory spending, because payroll taxes covers your Social Security, your Medicare, and your Medicaid. And you see that there is a difference in the amount collected and the amount spent. And it's around $1 trillion negative. That means either we are not paying enough taxes, payroll taxes, to cover mandatory spending, or there's a lack of financial discipline, there's a lack of efficiency, and there's a lack of effectiveness, which is basically wastage when it comes to dispersing these benefits. They are important, but can we reduce the wastage? Okay, so let's look at the stress test version. I explained this is the when the good worst. This is the good worst case, and this is the bad worst case. So you always want to compare what you are doing with what has happened. That'll give you a very good idea whether the stress test is useful or not. In this case, using the good worst case and the bad worst case, yes, it gives us a good idea if the government cost of borrowing goes up. And these are realistic numbers. So the point I want to bring up here is that this is the CBO's forecast of payments, the cost of payments for having public debt, interest rate. And you look at that, it's 2.63 maximum that they have implemented versus a worst case of in that same year of about 5.4% and bad worst case of 9.1%. So you can see that the CBO's forecast of what the government will pay for its public debt is substantially less than realistic worst cases. And this is the complete model. You can see the federal budget total receipts that is from taxes, and outlays is the expenditure. These two first 3 years are actual, and the subsequent years up to 2030, which is only 9 years away, is based on standard pro forma extrapolation for everything except where's this here? Net interest on public debt. So what we have done is, what I've done here is from this point onwards, I've increased the interest rate by 0.78, which is per year, which is the bad worst case. And we see that 9.95 is realistic because a number close to that, which is about 9.2, if I recall correctly, is what happened in the 80s. Okay, from that, we can now plot out where the money is coming from, the most important categories, which is individual income tax. That's the number when people talk about, when politicians talk about raising taxes, this is the number they talk about. Okay, but what they don't tell you is payroll tax, which is another tax you have to pay for, has been increasing since 1945, about that. has been increasing up to 29, and it's dropped slightly. But on average, the long term is that the payroll taxes are always going up. So relatively speaking, between individual income tax and payroll tax, individual income tax is flat, essentially flat, and payroll taxes is going up. So when you combine the two, because both these numbers come out of your wages, salaries. And so what we are seeing is, as a population, the total contribution of individual income tax plus payroll tax has substantially increased from about 15% in the 30s all the way up to about 85% in 2020. Okay, so the proportion, if you look at this here in mid 40s, it was about 50%, and here was about 25%. So that proportion has shifted, where the individuals, the wage earners, are now paying for the bulk of the federal budget. Okay, so what about our tax rates? So if we say that we are not going to borrow money to pay for the deficit, we are going to raise taxes. This is what happens. In 2019, your tax would have gone up by a third. In 2020, it would have gone up by double. So, so for every $1 of tax in 2020, every $1 of tax you paid to fund a federal budget that is not funded by debt, not partially funded by debt, that you would have to pay $2 in taxes, $2.07. If this trend continues, by 2030, the amount of taxes required to fund just the interest rate increases has gone up from $1 to $2.30. If you look at this, the previous graph here, what we're doing is, in this model, everything has been projected as pro forma for what's happening in this first 3 years, 2019 to 21, except that this net interest on public debt has been increased by 0.78% per year. And by 2030, that debt interest rate would be 9.9, practically 10%, which happened in the 80s. So, so we have to watch this. We have to watch how we spend the money, because we are laying a trap. If this budget forecast does not include any increases in the federal budget that is not related, that is not a constant ratio to the budget. That means if when we look at the $1.5 trillion budget, that's a substantial increase. If you take into account how it was brought down, the real budget is about $4 trillion. Okay, so what we are seeing is that without taking into that new budget, what we are seeing is that just on the cost of payment, that the tax required will be unbearable. So the moral of the story is that big government can only exist if we agree to pay those taxes. So from that, we can now have a disciplined approach, a good approach to defining what a big government is, something that is measurable from this budget, from any budget, any government budget. So big government occurs when the deficit is greater than 33% of the individual tax base, which is from 2019. It is something that the government, the current system can bear. And it's basically a test of the government's financial discipline. And the second requirement, it's an and it all, that the individual tax base, which is individual income plus payroll taxes, is greater than 80% of total receipts. That means it's totally dependent on individuals to pay for the government, to fund the government. Then we have big government. So when these two conditions, either or, happen from a financial perspective, we have big government. When you have and deficit and individual taxes, that's really bad news. So the first condition is a test of the government's financial discipline. The second condition is a test of real disposable income, because if the government is not getting its funding, as much funding from taxes, individual taxes, then what's happening is that people are keeping a larger chunk of their wages and salaries as disposable income. So this definition is independent of the kind of politics we have. Doesn't matter whether you're left or middle or center or right. It's purely an economic or financial measure of the budget, from the budget. Okay, so in concluding, I would like to say that if we have big government, having seen a single factor stress test, that means by saying single factor, we are only stressing the interest paid on public debt. If we had stressed the others, we will have greater deficits, or maybe smaller deficits. If we stress the income side, we'll have smaller deficits. If we stress the outlay side, the receipt side, then we'll have bigger deficits. So, and at the end of the day, we have to ask the question, if we want to have a budget that closes the deficit, who is going to pay those extra taxes? Is it going to be you that's paying the extra taxes, or is it going to be your children? Because debt carries down the road. It's not paid today, it'll be paid tomorrow, it'll be paid 10 years down the road. It is carried down the road. And so you have to decide who is going to pay for those taxes, you or your children. There are other problems with the budget, and that I will discuss in a future video. Thank you so much, and I hope you have um, uh, I hope you have enjoyed this talk.